Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all to this virtual exhibition that is accompanied by a lecture on Sri Aurobindo and India's freedom. This event is to celebrate the Azaadi ka Amrit Mahotsav of 75 years of independence with insights into the life of Sri Aurobindo, also known as Aurobindo Ghosh, one of the revolutionary freedom fighters. We are fortunate to celebrate the 125th anniversary of Sri Aurobindo also this year. The exhibition will take us through the contributions of Sri Aurobindo during the Indian freedom movement and highlight many of the unknown facts that gave direction and impetus to the freedom movement. We have our speaker here, Dr. Beloo Mehra, who has curated this exhibition, and the exhibition has been displayed in Pondicherry University also earlier, and then it was taken to the governor. Ms. Kirambedi was there, and she appreciated the exhibition so much that she wanted the exhibition to be kept for over a month, and all the school children and all the people of Pondicherry to be made aware through this exhibition of the contribution of Sri Aurobindo. So I welcome you all for this virtual exhibition and the lecture that will be accompanied. I now welcome our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Sir, Professor M. Krishnan. I invite now Dr. Beloo Mehra to start the virtual exhibition and go on with the lecture.
Namaste and good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Krishnan, DC Sir, and Dr. Pranjal to organize and this virtual exhibition and lecture event, and also to invite me to share this important work as part of your celebrations of Azaadi ka Amrit Mahotsav, celebrating 75 years of India's independence. I'm joined here by my colleague Biswajita, who's also helped with the designing of this exhibition. So I guess because the topic is so vast, so I'll go ahead straight away, jump into the topic itself, and then hopefully towards the end, we'll have a few minutes left to go over in case there are some questions or thoughts or comments from the participants, from those who are attending this event. So, like when we talk of Sri Aurobindo and India's freedom, it's so vast and it could take several hours to cover even still a part of that. So, but I'm going to try and summarize and highlight some of the events that we have curated in this exhibition, some of the key points from the great vast contribution that Sri Aurobindo had towards giving a direction to the India's freedom movement. And this will be done also in the context of his vast and deep yogic vision of what is India's role for the future of humanity, for the future of the world. So we'll come across some of those points as well. So let me start sharing my screen right away. So one of the first things that I think I would like to highlight this here is that how Sri Aurobindo saw India's freedom. India's freedom was seen by him in this larger context of the destiny of human race. So when he talked about that India must have Swaraj, freedom, he was invoking the vision of the idea of Swaraj also in the very Upanishadic sense of inner freedom. So he said India must have Swaraj in order to live for the world. But how? Not as a slave for the material and political benefit of a single purse-proud and selfish nation, which is what generally we understand the role of nation, to become materially and politically strong. That's the vision he did not have for India as a nation, but a free people for the spiritual and intellectual benefit of the human race. And it's really interesting that we are having this event today, February 7th, because February 6th, yesterday, marked a very important date. It was the anniversary of the return of Sri Aurobindo to India from England. And the year was 1893. And what is also interesting is that it was the same year in which Swami Vivekananda had gone to the West a few months after that. So, and how did Mother India welcome Sri Aurobindo, who was known by the name Aurobindo Ghosh at the time. She blessed him with a spiritual experience, which Sri Aurobindo later described as this vast calm that descended upon him and that stayed with him for many months afterwards. So it's really fortuitous that we are having to have this exhibition on just a day after this momentous date. So from 1893, let me jump to August 15th, 1947, the day India got political independence. And as many people here probably are aware, August 15th is also the birthday of Sri Aurobindo. And on 14th August, a special message was conveyed through Sri Aurobindo. It was recorded at the request of All India Radio Trichy, which was recorded in someone else's voice, but a very special message that he gave, which was broadcast on August 15th. And this is the message which I personally think all Indians should spend time reading and reflecting on, meditating on, because in that particular message, Sri Aurobindo gave his 5 main dreams, starting from his dream for the future of India to the dream for the future of the world, human unity. So anyway, I'll just quote a couple of passages from this speech, from this message that he gave on August 15th, 1947, the birthday of Free India. And he says it marks for her the end of an old era, the beginning of a new age. But we can also make it by our life and acts as a free nation an important date in a new age, opening for the whole world, for the political, social, cultural, and spiritual future of humanity. So this is the key that I would like all of us to spend some time reflecting on, that Sri Aurobindo's vision for Indian nation, Indian nationalism, Indian nationhood was not confined to what we today know as this landmass of India, but it was necessary for the whole humanity, for the future of humanity. So he was always looking at from nation to having a larger international vision. And in the same message, we also see him talking about August 15th is my own birthday. And it is naturally gratifying to me that it should have assumed this vast significance. And I take this coincidence not as a fortuitous accident, but as the sanction and seal of the divine force that guides my steps on the work with which I began life and the beginning of its full fruition. So this is, again, like I said, something we can spend a lot of time going over, especially the 5 dreams that Sri Aurobindo talks of in this particular speech, in this particular address. Now, interestingly, Sri Aurobindo had once said that he was first and foremost a poet and a revolutionary. And the bulk of this exhibition focuses on this political revolutionary aspect of Sri Aurobindo's life. He was one who was called by the British Viceroy, the Lord Minto, in early 1900s as the most dangerous man. Imagine, for the mighty British Empire of 20th century, this young Bengali, lean gentleman with a very soft voice and a deep set eyes was considered the most dangerous man. Now, why was he the most dangerous man? Could it be because of the might of his pen, the words with which he could incite this fire of freedom, this fire of, sacrificing everything and everything that one is for the cause of nation's freedom? Could it be that he could inspire so many young revolutionaries, or was there something more? I think the British also knew that there was something more to this exterior of this quiet Bengali gentleman who had this amazing set of, by the time we are talking early 1900s, he had this amazing set of academic accomplishments in his bag, and yet he had no air of pretense around him. So the British could also see that he had, underneath all that, was hiding this very calm, serene, and yet fiery, fierce aspiration and resolution of a yogi, of a rishi in making. And that's why they knew that India's history has been such that whenever India has gone into this deep slumber, it's the soul of the country, which expresses itself in her yogis and her rishis and her munis, that awakens the race, that awakens the people. So that's what probably I feel made him the most dangerous man for the British Empire. Now, so let's go back to this 1893 again, the day he lands. So these are just some other comments by Governor of Bengal. He's not a mere blind and unreasoning tool, but an active generator of revolutionary statement. Our most conspicuous and most dangerous opponent, one of the most dangerous factors in the present situation. So these are just more comments made by the British officials at the time. So now we go back to 1893 again, the Baroda period, when he comes. And as we know, he first joins Baroda service, working for the Maharaja of Baroda, Maharaja Gaikwad. And this period of 13 years that he's there in Baroda from 1893 to 1906 is a very interesting and important period in his life, and also how he sets up the revolutionary fervor for India's freedom movement. So there are 2 or 3 main things that should be highlighted. One is, of course, his work that he's doing for the Maharaja, in the revenue department, and then eventually starting teaching English and French at the college there, which is now MS University, Maharaja Sayaji Rao University in Baroda. The other important thing that he was engaged in, especially towards the later part of this 13 years, is he had been educated for 14 years in England. And he was, his father was insistent that he should be kept away, he and his brothers should be kept away from Indian culture as far as possible, that they should grow up to be, British in temperament. So he had imbibed all the best of the West, the Western classical languages, the Western classical literature. He had mastered Latin, Greek, and a lot of other Western languages and literature. And now in Baroda, he went into this inner journey of getting himself soaked into the best of the East, the best of the Indian culture and literature. So he taught himself Sanskrit, he taught himself Bengali, he studied Upanishads, he studied Ramayana, Mahabharata, Tamil works. He started translating many of the Sanskrit works of Kalidas, and Gujarati language also he started learning. He started translating things from Bengali also. That was another part of the work that he was doing. And then there was the political revolutionary work, which was primarily behind the screens, behind the veil. Except that right away when he comes to Baroda, early within few months of that, he started writing a series of articles anonymously called New Lamps for the Old. And this was in a journal titled Indu Prakash. And this was a 9-part series. It could have continued, but he was asked to stop because of his fiery language, because of the way he was able to really bring in all kinds of, his language, that fiery approach to his writing. And he was, let's remember, he was still in his early 20s at the time. But the interesting thing about this series of articles titled New Lamps for the Old was that his main target in these articles was not so much as the British government, but the policies of the Indian freedom attempt, the Congress working style at the time, and the kind of politics that they were engaged in. They were what Sri Aurobindo called as were indulging in a politics of begging, little reform here, little reform there, rather than demanding what was really needed, which was complete freedom from the foreign rule. So he was very critical of this approach to asking for freedom. And so right in his 20s, he started, through his words, he was showing people how what is required is a path of boldness and courage to, only the bold and the courage deserve freedom. And one should be ready to sacrifice for the freedom that is so essential for people to survive. So the other things that I mentioned, were sort of working from behind the scenes between 1902 and 1906. He sort of became a secret link from a lot of small revolutionary groups. He sent his own brother, younger brother, Baran Ghosh, about whom we'll talk in a little bit, to Bengal, and also Jatin Banerjee. Together, they started working, recruiting young revolutionaries to work in Bengal, to create this spirit in the mind of the people that why freedom is essential, why we should be ready to sacrifice everything for the cause of freedom. So he was trying to change the political scenario of that time. So I'll keep jumping to the next one. These are some of the other, the names of people that he was meeting on the eastern side of the country and also on the western side of the country, and working as a secret link between the revolutionary groups. So we've quoted, what are some of his writings from that time, and other biographers. This is also the time, I'm just going to jump quickly because of the interest of the time. He also met some of the other revolutionary figures. A few that we name here are Sister Nivedita, who also comes later when Sri Aurobindo asks her to edit one of the journals later on in 1910. So Sister Nivedita was another key revolutionary figure, of somebody whose speeches and whose talks were inspiring a disciple of Sri Aurobindo. So he met her at that time. He also meets Tilak at this time. That's where their association begins. This is still while he is in Baroda. And then comes, another important key figure, the revolutionary that he meets during this time was Jatin Mukherjee. Now, Bhaga Jatin is a very interesting figure in Indian freedom, Indian revolutionary movement. Because the reason why he got the name was that it is the legend is that he was 10 years old when he had killed a tiger with his bare hands. That's how the name Bag, that means tiger. Bhaga Jatin came to be associated with him. So Sri Aurobindo had a very, very high regard for him. He said he was one of the best, someone who would belong to the front rank of humanity anywhere. And in fact, even the British commissioner, the British government also thought of, that they called him as one of the bravest Indians. So Sri Aurobindo, and he again worked closely, especially on this one aspect of recruiting those soldiers who were there in the British Army to the cause of the Indian revolutionary movement. So that was one point on which they both agreed and worked together. Now, another important event that happens during this time is the Partition of Bengal, 1905. This is what becomes a turning point in Sri Aurobindo's political revolutionary career as well, that now he's forced to come out in the public and forced to take a stance that, sort of like come out and work from the front. And in fact, he gives his very first public speech in September 1905, where he talks about why Bengal should not accept this partition. But of course, as we know in history, the partition goes through. Sri Aurobindo and several other revolutionaries go and, there is a protest march, and Sri Aurobindo and Bipin Chandra Pal lead that protest, and so we know that history. Now, There are two pieces of writing that I would like to highlight from this period before we go to the 1906 to 1910 period. One is this little classic, this has become sort of like a classic piece of literature in Indian political, classic piece in India's political literature. It's this pamphlet called Bhavani Mandir. And this is another interesting work of Sri Aurobindo from early days that I think all, especially the young college university students, should read. This was inspired by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Anand Math. Sri Aurobindo later said that it was originally the idea of his brother Baran Ghosh, but Sri Aurobindo wrote this. This was a key piece of evidence that was used by the British during the 1908-1909 Alipur bomb trial, for which both Baran Ghosh and Sri Aurobindo were arrested, along with several other key revolutionaries. And we'll come to that a little bit in the story, a little bit later. But this is interesting piece of literature because it actually gave a very correct diagnosis of what is it that was ailing Indian nation at that time and how to remedy it. So Sri Aurobindo, I think we have a slide that talks about that. So what Sri Aurobindo talked about there is that in India, we fail in everything for the want of Shakti. And he goes on to say, what good will our bhakti and jnana do? All this devotion and all this knowledge that we have, if we don't have the courage, the strength to execute it. And the solution was to invoke the strength from the highest possible source of strength, which is the Aadhi Shakti herself, the creatrix herself, the mother power, the divine feminine Shakti herself. So this is where we begin to see how Sri Aurobindo brings in this notion of a very high, deep spiritual nationalism, that whatever work we have to do for this nation, for our beloved motherland, the strength for that, like everything else, comes from the highest source. So it's not just a mere love for one's motherland, his notion of patriotism, his notion of nationalism, but it's really an adoration, a worship of the mother that is our land, that is our motherland. It's like, the land itself, the nation itself becomes one's mother, one's Shakti, the power, the Godhead that he's talked about. In addition to this piece of writing, another piece of writing is a letter of Sri Aurobindo, which he had written to his wife, dated 30th August 1905. And this was the first time Sri Aurobindo talked about his inner life, in a sense, his three madnesses. He said, these are my three madnesses. And we can, of course, look at them as sort of like the markings of the yogi revolutionary that he was. So what are these three madnesses? His three madness, the first one is that he said, I firmly believe that all the accomplishments, the genius, the higher education, the learning, the wealth that God has given me are his. I have a right to spend for my own purposes only what is needed for the maintenance of the family and is otherwise absolute essential. The rest must be returned to God. This is the becoming of Sri Aurobindo from Aurobindo Ghosh. He even said, if we read the whole letter, he even talks about that how I feel like a thief when I keep more than what is required for my basic sustenance. So this is my madness, that everything that I have attained actually is divine's, and it should go back to the divine. That is, he said, my first madness. My second madness is, he says, it is this: by whatever means, I must have the direct vision of God. If God exists, there must be some way to experience his existence, to meet him face to face. However arduous this path is, I have made up my mind to follow it. This is his second madness. And the third madness is where everyone else looks upon their country as an inert piece of matter, a few meadows and fields, forests and hills and rivers. I look upon my country as the mother. I adore her, I worship her. What would a son do if a demon sat on his mother's breast and started sucking her blood? This is the kind of fire we see in this revolutionary Sri Aurobindo. So again, another wonderful piece of writing, this letter to Mrinalini Devi, his wife, that I would highly recommend that all Indian youth, especially in colleges and universities, must read. So then we come to this Bengal partition that happened that I'd already spoken of. During this time, while he's still employed in Baroda, the Maharaja's service, he's constantly taking extended leaves, going to Bengal, engaging in political revolutionary work. Then, of course, the procession that is led in Barisal Conference in 1906, opposing the partition, and so on. Then in 1906 comes two key publications that Sri Aurobindo sort of takes charge of. One is again at the suggestion of his brother, Baran Ghosh, who's also a key revolutionary figure, one of our unsung heroes in India's freedom movement. This is a, Yugantar is a Bengali paper that they start, a Bengali journal that they start. And what is interesting about this particular publication, Bengali, you know, even to this day, if you see old Bangla movies, you will see people reading in those trams in old Calcutta streets, Yugantar. It was a major popular publication at that time. So we're talking 1906, early 1900s. And of course, it stopped by the time Sri Aurobindo was arrested and by 1909. This Yugantar was interesting because Sri Aurobindo had made this policy that this paper will not accept foreign government. It will not accept the existence of foreign governments. So if they are ever arrested or caught, if the paper is ever taken into court, they will not defend themselves because they simply deny the existence of the foreign rule, of the foreign government, of the British rule. So this stance of Yugantar made it extremely popular. Most of the articles were written by Baran Ghosh, Avinash Bhattacharya, several other revolutionaries. Sri Aurobindo was also writing, but he was generally of a more sort of like a more balanced tone. But the other younger revolutionaries were writing very fiery articles, even articles that had instructions on guerrilla warfare. Then in the same year, on the suggestion of Bipin Chandra Pal, he takes over another publication, which again becomes this massively popular journal at the time called Bandi Mataram. This was in English. And Sri Aurobindo again takes over as, you know, the whole policy, the whole direction of this paper, as well as the key editor and the key writer. This is where we find most of Sri Aurobindo's political writing before his arrest in 1908. So in fact, I have this book here since this is thick. This is Bande Mataram writings. So if anybody is interested, these should be available easily. It's in Bande Mataram, we find Sri Aurobindo talking of his vision of Swaraj, his vision of Swadeshi. He was the first leader to demand complete independence, Poon Swaraj. He lays out a complete program of boycott Swadeshi, a complete boycott of the government universities and colleges, and instead starting national, what they call as national colleges and schools, boycotting not just foreign and British goods, but also complete non-cooperation with the British bureaucratic, administrative judiciary system and rather going in for more national arbitration kind of schemes. So he lays out a whole program, which was later on used by the freedom fighters who came from after 1915 onwards. So this is like just a picture of the Lal Bal Pal. I think most history students here would know that this was the revolutionary, the nationalists party, often called as extremists or terrorists by the British, but they were the revolutionaries of the time. I will jump quickly to, again, more things going on from 1906 onwards. Now, 1907 is interesting because now he has become more and more dangerous because he's openly talking of Swaraj and Swadeshi and boycott. And so the British start doing a very aggressive crackdown on both Uganda and Bandi Mataram. This is the time he was arrested, and even a case for sedition was filed against him, but they could not prove anything, so he was released. But both the Uganda and Bandi Mataram offices were searched. They couldn't find, so nothing could happen. This is also the time in 1907, Sri Aurobindo Rabindranath Tagore comes and meets Sri Aurobindo. He meets him again in 1928 in Pondicherry also, but it's still in Bengal. From 1906 onwards, Sri Aurobindo has moved to Bengal. Very fun, interesting little detail about meeting of Sri Aurobindo and Rabindranath Tagore is that because the British tried to arrest him and they couldn't find anything, so there is Rabindranath Tagore makes a joke that you've deceived us, Babu, Mosha, you deceived us. And Sri Aurobindo laughs and says, not for long, as if he knew that his arrest was coming a year later. So it's a very interesting piece of little history. Yes, so this is where he said in half jest, Ki Mashai, Amai Hanki Dilan, what sir, how you have deceived me? And Sri Aurobindo laughs and replies in English, not for long. And it was exactly after 7 months that he was arrested in the Alipur bomb jail. But when Sri Aurobindo meets Rabindranath Tagore in 1907, Rabindranath Tagore calls him as the voice of the nation, the voice incarnate. So that poem itself is very marvelous as a piece of historical literature. Sri Aurobindo continues with Bande Mataram since they couldn't find anything against him. He's also giving a lot of speeches. So we have kind of just listed here all the dates of the public speeches. And then comes another interesting turning point in India's freedom movement history, which is the Surat Congress in 1907, where there is a split between the moderates and the nationalists. I studied history in Hindi, so the Naram Dal and the Garam Dal, that's what they were called. So this is what is interesting about that 1907 Congress. Now, in Bande Mataram, you will find several writings of Sri Aurobindo where he is encouraging the nationalists to attend in maximum number this Surat Congress. So he talks about things like what is a nationalist good for if he cannot make up by his enthusiasm and energy for his other deficiencies, if he cannot make nothing of difficulties and turn the impossible into the possible. He realizes how difficult it is for people to travel with limited resources at their disposal. And yet he says, go in as large numbers to Surat to attend this particular Congress, to attend this particular meeting so that the nationalists' cause could be put forward. And he encourages people to sacrifice. He talks about nations do not prosper without self-sacrifice. The self-respect of the nation is our religion. Self-sacrifice is our only action or duty. And then at the Congress, when the split happens, Sri Aurobindo is the key figure, which most history books don't record it like that, but he is the key figure that leads to the split that happens between moderates and nationalists at that Congress. And later on in letter, Sri Aurobindo acknowledges that history very seldom records the things that were decisive but took place behind the veil. He says, very few people know that it was I, without consulting Tilak, who gave the order that led to the breaking of Congress and was responsible for the refusal to join the newfangled moderate convention, which were one of the two decisive happenings at Surat. So this is another important piece of history. Another quick thing that I should mention is here that starting from 1904 onwards, Sri Aurobindo was engaged in his inner spiritual yoga, his inner spiritual sadhana. So that had started from his Baroda period itself, but he always said that my yoga is for the nation. I want to gain deeper strength, more strength, so that I can work more and more for the nation. And then in 1908, he meets, at the request of his brother again, he meets a Maharashtrian yogi, Vishnu Bhaskar Lele, who shows him some, this inner work through which he can gain an inner silence, a complete silence of the consciousness. And Sri Aurobindo attains that in a matter of 3 days. Elsewhere, somewhere he writes, it took me 2 to 3 days to attain that complete mental silence. All political work that he does after this realization is done in complete mental silence. So this is another aspect of this revolutionary work, in this state of complete nirvanic silence. So this is how the yogi revolutionary was going on. He was writing all kinds of fiery speeches. He was delivering all kinds of fiery speeches. He was writing all kinds of fiery editorials, all in that complete silence. Again, some more details about his various speeches, his various writings, and the British are more and more threatened because now he has gained that inner silence through which this work is becoming more and more effective, more and more forceful and powerful. So there is great repression going on of all freedom workers, especially the nationalists, especially the freedom, the revolutionaries. And I'm just jumping few slides before we get to his arrest in 1908. So just to kind of change, before we go to Sri Aurobindo's arrest, just a little introduction to this another unsung hero, Baran Ghosh, Barendra Kumar Ghosh, Sri Aurobindo's younger brother, who was also arrested with him in 1908, 3 days before Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo was arrested on 5th May. He was arrested on 2nd May. Now, I think I mentioned earlier a few of the ways in which Baran was associating with Sri Aurobindo on the revolutionary work. So this Yugantar or Jugantar, however you want to spell it, it was not only a nationalist paper, a revolutionary paper at the time, but Baran, along with Bagha Jatin, started pulling out some group of revolutionaries and form a secret society who would be training themselves to prepare for an armed resistance, armed militancy activities, if required, to free the nation. So this is what made Baran quite popular among the young revolutionaries. And of course, as we know, or at least many people here might know, that while Sri Aurobindo was released exactly a year later in 1909, because of, again, lack of evidence. And when we say lack of evidence, there were at least more than 1,000 documents that were produced to, prosecute Sri Aurobindo, and hundreds of witnesses were called in, and yet they couldn't trace anything. They couldn't find anything by which to directly say that he was involved in the bomb case. But Baran Ghosh and several other revolutionaries were given were not released. They were accused of sedition. They were given, like a sentence of hanging, but which was later, after the appeal, reduced to a life sentence, which was exile in Andaman Nicobar, the cellular jail, which is sort of like the dreaded, cellular jail of Andamans. And that's where Baran Ghosh spent from 1909 to 1920. In 1920, there was a special mercy, was going on. Several of the political prisoners were released by the British government at the time. So that life sentence was reduced to, in 1920, that's when he was released. So this is a little bit more details about Baran Ghosh. He was, so Ulaskar, that they were both sentenced to death, but it was reduced to life imprisonment and sent into Andaman in 1909. Now there in Andaman Nicobar, he has written an account of those dreaded, almost from 1909 to 1920, the years that he spent there. He wrote a book in Bengali called Vipantarer Katha, Baran Ghosh, which was later on translated by Nalinikant Gupta. And it was published in 1922, 2 years after his release from Andaman's cellular jail. And interestingly, this book, after 1922, it went out of print for almost 100 years. Still in 2011, it was again published by Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry. This is another important piece of historical document because it talks about this chapter of India's freedom movement. What kind of setup was there in this Andaman jail? These days people go and visit this cellular jail as part of their tourism in Andaman. But what was the kind of life, how these political prisoners were being treated? It's a wonderful piece of book, and I'm sorry I didn't bring that book here. It's in my bookshelf downstairs. But another wonderful piece of historical writing that should be read by in our schools and colleges. So why this book was stayed out of print for so long, that itself speaks of how our history or historiography is done, how our history has been written and taught, what chapters in our India's freedom movement history have been left out of our main discourse. Then in 1923, Baran Ghosh comes and lives in Pondicherry with Sri Aurobindo and the mother, who had also joined by that time. And, very interestingly, because he also has this yogic yearning in him, this inner life that was blossoming in him. And under the spiritual guidance of Sri Aurobindo and his spiritual collaborator, whom we call as the mother, he not only developed several, he not only grew in his spiritual sadhana, he also developed this side of him as a painter. He did many paintings under the guidance of the mother, who was an accomplished artist herself. And these are just two of the portraits of Sri Aurobindo that he had made during that 6-year period. And in 1929, he goes back to Bengal again and goes back to journalism. He's continues to do a lot of writing. So now, from younger brother to the elder brother again, the arrest that happens in May 1908. Just like Baran Ghosh has given a whole account of his imprisonment in this book called The Tale of My Exile, Sri Aurobindo wrote in Bengali an account of his imprisonment, starting from when they came to arrest him to his experiences in the prison, Kara Kahini, which was also translated in English later as Tales of Prison Life. Another very, very interesting piece of historical document, that historical literature that history students especially should be interested in reading. Now, for most people, prison would be a prison. You know, our freedom is taken over. But for Sri Aurobindo, prison becomes a yoga ashram. He says in a joking sort of way that the best thing that the only result, I'll just quote from him directly. He says, the only result of the wrath, the anger of the British government was that I found God. The British were so angry, they kept him in the prison. And there he comes face to face with that God. The second madness about which he had written to his wife in 1905. So Sri Aurobindo has a major spiritual experience in the prison, which he talks about in one of his speeches, one of his actually very first speech after his release in 1909 at Uttarpara in Bengal. And we'll come to that in a minute. But there, Sri Aurobindo again indulges in deep inner spiritual work. He comes to a recognition that his work is no longer for the political freedom of India, but for a much deeper inner freedom of India and the entire human race. And all of this he talks about in this Tales of Prison Life. It's a tiny little book, but it's an amazing piece of literature because it's also full of great wit and humor. Lots of humor of what Sri Aurobindo was observing in the prison. All kinds of, this was, the solitary confinement cell where he was. Few details are there. Hopefully, if we do do an exhibition in person, students will have much longer to go over the details of each of these posters. So the trial that happens, the historic trial, this was one of the first trials in India of that magnitude. And he was charged with conspiracy, sedition, waging war against the king, which was, of course, at that time punishable with death by hanging. So 1,000 artifacts, 222 witnesses in the preliminary trial, 1,438 exhibits and 206 witnesses in the sessions court. And they still couldn't find anything. All kinds of, in the Tales of Prison Life, Sri Aurobindo writes of all kinds of interesting little things that happen, the kinds of, very filmy revenge, traitors, all kinds of situation that happens. Another interesting thing that happens in case of Sri Aurobindo is he develops an inner vision, an inner eye to appreciate very, very deeply the truth on the beauty of Indian painting tradition. Sri Aurobindo always had a keen aesthetic eye for Indian architecture and Indian sculpture. The painting, he said, developed for him in the prison. So the beauty of colors and what was Indian painting tradition, the inner dimension of that eye, that vision opens for him in the prison. So again, a deep inner experiences that he goes on. He also has visions of with visits with Swami Vivekananda, with Sri Krishna during his prison. He talks of all those things later on in his speeches and in his writings. At his defense, in the closing statement, the famous lawyer of that time, Deshbandhu Chittaranjan Das, another important figure in India's freedom movement, he's Sri Aurobindo's defense lawyer, and he calls Sri Aurobindo as the prophet of nationalism, the poet of patriotism, and the lover of humanity. And he talks about that, the long after this controversy is hushed in silence, long after this agitation ceases, long after he is dead and gone, that is Sri Aurobindo, he will be looked upon as the poet of patriotism, as the prophet of nationalism and the lover of humanity. Long after he's dead and gone, his words will be echoed and re-echoed, not only in India, but across distant seas and lands. How prophetic in 150th year of Sri Aurobindo. We are seeing this exactly how the world is coming together to celebrate this 150th year of Sri Aurobindo's birth. So exactly a year, 5th May 1908, he is arrested. 6th May 1909, he is released. The judgment, by the way, the judge who was presiding over the trial was Sri Aurobindo's classmate from England. Very interesting turn of events in the history. He was acquitted of all the charges, and the judge said that all the evidence that was against him was very flimsy in nature. Now, Sri Aurobindo then later on writes a letter which talks of his sort of like his thanking the countrymen for his release. And it's very interesting how he says that I attribute my escape to no human agency, but first of all to the protection of the mother of us all, who has never been absent from me, but always held me in her arms and shielded me from grief and disaster. And secondarily to the prayers of thousands which have been going up to her on my behalf ever since I was arrested. If it is the love of my country which led me into the danger, it is also the love of my countrymen which has brought me safe through it, death. So it's this is what the yogi, the patriot, the revolutionary that Sri Aurobindo was. His very first speech after his acquittal, again, another important piece of historical document, because there he again lays out his agenda for how he understands love for the nation. What is nationalism? And he talks about his spiritual experiences in the prison, where he says that I looked at the jail, I looked at all the bars, I looked during my trial at the prosecutor, at my defense lawyer, at the judge, everyone in the courtroom, and all he sees is Sri Krishna. So this realization of Vasudevam Sarvamiti, he speaks of that in this particular speech. And he says, even in the prison, among the thieves, the murderers, the swindlers, all he could see was Sri Aurobindo, was Sri Krishna. So this awakening of seeing God in all, not just in myself, is again a very important, when we read Sri Aurobindo's writings on yoga, on integral yoga, that is another major transformation that happens in the path of yoga. And Sri Aurobindo has this while in prison. And in this particular speech, again, this is a sort of like a plaque that is there in the grounds where this speech was delivered, which is now part of the public library, Jai Krishna Public Library in Uttarpara. And he talks about what it means for India to rise. He talks about the universal Sanatan Dharma and how the rise of that Dharma, which is not confined to a narrow understanding of religion, but which has a universal appeal to humanity. The rise of India is for the rise of that Dharma, that universal eternal Dharma. And whenever that Dharma will rise, India will rise. India's rise is to enable that rise of the Dharma. Now, at this time, Sri Aurobindo realizes that both Uganda and Bandi Mataram have been closed down, have been shut down. Most of the nationalists have gone in the background because the key figures, 37 people were arrested during that time in 1908. So now Sri Aurobindo starts 2 new journals. He does try to continue and, single-handedly, he is giving speeches at political rallies, talking about the nationalists' cause. And he also starts a couple of different publications. One is called the Karma Yogin, and this is in English, and another in Bengali called the Dharma. There again, we find a great pieces of literature on what is a nation, what is the deeper definition of nation, what is the deeper definition of nationalism. And many of these have been compiled by Sri Aurobindo Ashram in this volume called Sri Aurobindo on Nationalism. So most of his political speeches, there is another compilation they have made of speeches of Sri Aurobindo on Indian politics and national education. This one has even like pre-1908 speeches, but the writings on nationalism are primarily from the Karma Yogin writings. There, Sri Aurobindo defines what it means to be a true nationalist. He says our first business is to realize ourselves first and to mold everything to the law of India's eternal life in nature. And he talks about what will be this ideal. I'll show you what's there in the next, another important slide. This is again from the Karmi Yogin. He talks of our ideal of patriotism, which proceeds on the basis of love and brotherhood. And it looks beyond the unity of the nation and envisages the ultimate unity of mankind. He talks of his ideal of Swaraj, which involves no hatred of any other nation, nor of the administration, which is now established by law in this country. But what we want to do is, we want to make our rule Indian. Instead of the foreign control, we want to make it Indian control. What we are seeking is a unity of brothers, equals, and freemen, not as the unity of master and serf, which is what the foreign rule would do. And he also again reminds the young, he's always talking to the young mind and the young heart of the people, and that he talks of future belongs to the young. This is just like a tiny sample of his writings from Karmi Yogin. He talks of how a brave, frank, clean-hearted, courageous, and aspiring youth is the only foundation on which the future nation can be built. So he continues single-handedly the nationalist cause, giving speeches, writing, talking of the unity of the nation and things like that. And then comes around mid-February 1910, when he receives another information that the government would be searching for him and would probably be still arresting him again. He was still the most dangerous man. Let us never forget that. And so he just immediately sort of, he turns inward and he gets this command from inside, a voice from inside, to go to Chandarnagar in French India. And he immediately leaves his pen and somehow writes a letter, contacts Sister Nivedita, whom he had met in Baroda, and asks her to take over the editorship of Karmi Yogin, and goes to Chandarnagar. The Chandarnagar period is also very interesting because there he's indulged in, not only he's living in a secret residence, which was necessary so that he could not be arrested, but this was French territory, not the British territory, though the British were constantly looking for him. He stays there for a little more than a month, till 31st March, and he's engaged in deep sadhana there. He has experiences of Vedic goddesses during this time, and there are accounts of how deeply engaged he was in his meditation by Motilal Roy, in whose house he was staying in hiding. Then in end of March of 1910, he gets another inner command, another divine command to proceed to Pondicherry. And on April 1st, he leaves. First, he goes from 31st March, he goes to Kolkata back. From there, leaves for Pondicherry, takes a boat, leaves for Pondicherry. And on 4th April 1910, he arrives at Pondicherry. So you can see some of the pictures here of the ghat at Chandarnagar from where he sailed to Pondicherry and the old Pondicherry port at that time. And from this was the house, the first house where Sri Aurobindo stayed in hiding for many, a long time. And this incidentally is also the house where Swami Vivekananda had stayed once. And this is also the house they say Subramanyam Bharati used to visit, because only a few people in Pondicherry knew. Subramanyam Bharati, I didn't talk about him, but that's another important figure in India's freedom movement, and his association with Sri Aurobindo, and how they talked of their love for the motherland, India's ancient culture. And, Subramanyam Bharati helped him learn Sanskrit, helped him translate many, sorry, it's not Sanskrit, sorry, Tamil, helped him translate a lot of Tamil poetry, Tamil Vaishnav Bhakti poetry, Andal's poetry into English. And Sri Aurobindo helped him learn many things of the Vedic literature. So that's another important key figure that we don't talk about in this particular exhibition. And this house is still there in Pondicherry for anyone who is ever here. They opened this house, I mean, it's owned by a family, by a Shankar Chettiar's family still. And this picture was taken every April 4th. They decorate this hallway and the particular room where Sri Aurobindo used to live in hiding. And this was the picture taken on April 4th, 2020. And here in Pondicherry, Sri Aurobindo is primarily engaged in his yoga, in his spiritual work. But for him, his yoga was never about attaining some afterworld, other world. For him, his yoga, as he said many, many times, and as we find always in his writings on integral yoga, all life is yoga. So his yoga, his spirituality had always been this worldly and otherworldly. So this is where, while on the outside, he has taken a complete retirement from political activity, inwardly he's aware of, through his spiritual force, he's aware of what is going on. And at a few times in history, which I'm not going to go into at this point, he does make direct intervention also in India's and world's political historical events, including the World War II. So now, the interesting thing is Sri Aurobindo himself writes in his autobiographical notes that the British continued to doubt that Sri Aurobindo has taken a complete retirement from political activity. They couldn't believe, and they were still till 1940. They kept thinking that he might still do something, that he would still be the most dangerous man. And but of course, we know the history is different. There are a couple more other things that we could go into, maybe if there are some questions that about Sri Aurobindo's writings on his spiritual nationalism. But I think I will stop here with just this one quote from Sri Aurobindo, where he talks about that we should also keep this in mind, that India's only politics is spirituality. And the fulfillment of the eternal dharma, the Sanatan dharma, is in true ways, it's only Swaraj. And the ideal of nationalism that he puts forward is to return of India, he says, on her eternal self, the restoration of her splendor, greatness, triumphant Asiatic supremacy. And this is the ideal that he puts, that India rises for the rise of the dharma, for the rise of yoga also, he somewhere writes in another context. And it's no wonder why International Yoga Day, when the idea was floated in United Nations, how within a matter of days, more than 150 countries accept, because this is the truth of the destiny of this nation called India. This is what India is supposed to give to the world. So I will stop sharing here, and I will see if there are any comments or questions or thoughts. So, Pranjal, it's yours. And I should apologize that I rushed through some very important points, but I wanted to cover a whole lot of ground.
So it was very insightful to come to know about so many unknown facts that we have about Sri Aurobindo, and most of the history books are of most of his facts. And I think in very brief, the entire contribution of Sri Aurobindo is done away with even in the school books. So thank you for this very deep insight, and I hope we will be able to bring the offline exhibition to the university very soon once the situation normalizes. So are there some questions by the participants? And we can take up the questions. So I think a lot of these things, these materials that Dr. Beloo has told to us about. They are available online also if people are interested in reading these things in detail. The speeches of Sri Aurobindo about the Karma Yogin or Vande Mataram and all those publications, they are available online on the Sri Aurobindo Ashram website, I guess. So that is accessible. So I thank you, Dr. Beloo. I thank our Vice Chancellor, sir, for letting us host this wonderful event and bring these deeper insights of historical importance of one of the revolutionaries who is set up an ashram so close to our Thiruvarur, Pondicherry, just 150 kilometers, and definitely the whole impact. Our registrar ma'am, our dean, our HOD sir of Department of History for helping us patronizing and hosting this exhibition, virtual exhibition and the lecture. And I thank Dr. Beloo once again for bringing us the deeper insights, bringing us the historical facts. I'm sure everybody is benefited from these facts.
Thank you very much for that wonderful slides. And I think even we know that how that Aurobindo involved in revolution, but I couldn't find anywhere else why he moved to Bengal to Pondicherry. Any reason for that?
Yes.
I couldn't see that any message.
Yeah, actually, as I think I quickly mentioned towards the later part of the talk, it was an inner command. Because when he was in the prison, he had been given this clear message from Sri Krishna himself. He talks of how Sri Krishna tells him that I am raising you for another work. This work of India's independence is done. It is granted. So we are talking 1909, 1908, 1909. Sri Aurobindo inwardly had this clear sense that India's freedom is a done deal. It is happening. He also talks about it later that the lines on which the India's independence movement have been set, the lines are set, but it will be done in a different sort of way. Because the nation's consciousness is not yet ready for that kind of revolution for which Sri Aurobindo and several other revolutionaries were preparing. So he talks of the tapasya of the nation in a later writing, that a nation's consciousness has to be ready to take on that kind of revolutionary fervor. So he said India's freedom will be won, but in a different sort of way along the same lines. So when Gandhiji and others come into freedom movement scene, they take the same ideas of Swadeshi and Swaraj and boycott, but they give a little different turning to it. It's a more moralistic, mental, idealistic, ethical kind of a turning with this idea of non-violence. Sri Aurobindo talks of that a nation is entitled to win freedom even by violence if that is required. He says, though it should not be done, violence should not be acceptable or unacceptable as a matter of moralistic policy, but as a matter of political tactic. So this kind of thought, the nation's consciousness has to be ready. So he didn't find that because of a lot of suppression and repression that had happened as a result of very cruel British policies at the time, and the influence of certain other political figures that had come into the picture. He felt that more tapasya is needed for the nation. And so he inwardly knew that his work is leading him somewhere. And then when he gets this inner command, go to Pondicherry, because he's being raised for a different kind of work, that voice of Sri Krishna. He just drops his pen and leaves. It's no second thought. It is not a mental decision. It is his soul's voice that guides him there.
But so many activities of Aurobindo, where I can see that 1900 to 1910 or 11 like that. But what's the relationship with Aurobindo with Mahatma Gandhi? There is
Well,
no, right?
there is no relation except that.
Not relation, I am saying, not direct meaning. What's the
no.
joint program with Aurobindo and Mahatma Gandhi?
No, there is no joint program, no meeting of their ways of looking at the future of India also in that sense. In fact, a few times Gandhiji had expressed interest.
Some controversy between Mahatma Gandhi thoughts and Aurobindo?
No, I would not call it like that, except that they understood many things differently, in the sense that Gandhian approach was to bring to give the freedom movement a more of a moralistic turn. Non-violence, ahimsa it is of course the highest dharma. Indian thought speaks of ahimsa paramo dharma. But at the same time, it can be one's own moral, ethical ideal. It cannot be a political tool, because Sri Aurobindo speaks of from a deeper spiritual, psychological sense. He says that when in the masses, when you repress this feeling of strength and power and courage, which our ancient Indian thought always valued in the figure of Kshatriyahood. See, we talked of Kshatriyahood. Kshatriyas were trained in the art of warfare. We had our rishis teaching princes the art of warfare. So this is an aspect of human nature that has to blossom, that has to come to its own flowering. When in the masses of people, when you suppress this tendency, it comes out in the form of hooliganism. So Sri Aurobindo was concerned about that, and which is exactly what has come true if we talk of this. Anytime Indians are unhappy over something, we see rioting on the street. We see hooliganism. So Sri Aurobindo said, I am sure India will win freedom. My concern is what will India do with that freedom? He's talked about two dangers. One, he said Bolshevism, which is the rise of, like this fight between, the capitalists versus the labor class. And second, the bigger threat he said was Gunda Raj. That's the phrase he used. The street level politics, the street level fighting, both things we see abundantly in India happening. Gandhian approach was that you keep turning your moralistic idea into a political tool, which will never happen from a psychological truth. So Sri Aurobindo's approach was from a deeper human psychology. Gandhian approach was from a purely, he even used the word, Sri Aurobindo used a biblical mentalized ideal. So which will not fit in with the Indian truth, which values all aspects of human nature, including the Kshatriyahood, the courage. So he talks about that integral human personality requires 4 qualities: wisdom, courage, the power of harmony, of beauty, and the power of perfection in service, perfection in work. So these are the 4 powers that you need. So you can't take out the power of, the force of power, the courage, away from the societal mind, the collective mind of nation. So there's no controversy, but there's a very different way of looking at human psyche.
But I have a lot of questions. Maybe
Yes.
personally, I visit Dr. Beloo in Pondicherry, then I will ask that.
Yes.
Because he has taken Mahatma Gandhi, taken the word of Swaraj, right, later 1927.
Yes.
When he is having that lot of thing. But I don't know that even Aurobindo didn't talk about Mahatma, or Mahatma didn't talk about, but ideally they are same, right?
No.
We have to go for ideally means what I want to say, that we should not go for what you called the fighting like even earlier, before 1900, where you had a lot of fight, so many death and other things. Both they didn't like it. Am I right? No. If you are talking about Mardu brothers or Velu Nachiyar or anybody, I mean, before 1900, they died. Everybody died because of that power. But later, the two people are talking about that Swaraj, right? But I don't know that. I couldn't understand that why they are not coming together.
No, I mean, in the larger sense, Gandhian approach was an important because Gandhian approach did serve an important purpose. It's not to say when we look at history in this very, long picture, the big picture, everything serves a purpose. So even that approach serves a purpose because we as a collective are yet to be ready for that integral development that Sri Aurobindo is referring to. So I wouldn't say that Gandhian approach was a complete failure. No, it served a purpose, especially as tactical strategy. As a strategy, there was no way India could have had this. India was ready for an armed revolution against the British. Where would the arms come from? So even from a strategic point of view, non-violence was the right strategy to use at that time. So these are, like you said, when you come visit here, we can talk in detail about these things because there are some letters of Sri Aurobindo referring to these things. Then later on in 1942, when the Cripps Commission comes, there is some interaction not directly between Sri Aurobindo and Gandhi, but other members of the Congress at that time, and the letter that was sent by Sri Aurobindo. So there are some other incidents also that bring the two together directly or indirectly. So yes, we should have a longer conversation about that.
Thank you. This is on behalf of our university. I request you to visit Central University of Tamil Nadu, and also you can give some ideas how we can take that patriotism to our students. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, please, Sneka.
Yeah. Actually, ma'am, I saw the background picture is there, ma, as we say, because I'm a North Indian. And just I wanted, because you have given a very beautiful insight about the Sri Aurobindo. And as you mentioned, that painting, it's inspired by my mother. So how Ramakrishna Paramahansa was inspired, and very, you can say, a central part of his life was Ma Sharda. So just your thoughts, if time permits, how mother was the central figure on this his spiritual journey, especially Aurobindo, when he became Aurobindo, right? Sri Aurobindo, how he has evolved from that prison and how he has taken up himself. So this was a very, you can say, a very important type of aspect what he had, his transformation. So as you have observed lots of, you have thoughts about Aurobindo. So little bit you can share about mother, how mother has influenced Aurobindo.
So Dr. Pranjal, we may not have much time for this.
Yeah, sure, ma'am.
This could be another several hours long discussion. Yeah. But I will quickly just introduce the mother as such. So what we understand is the mother was the spiritual collaborator of Sri Aurobindo.
Yes.
So she came to India. She was of French Algerian descent. She comes to India in 1914, meets Sri Aurobindo for the first time, and then has to go back because the First World War has started. So she has to go back, and she goes to Japan at that time. But her inner self, her soul is there with Sri Aurobindo. And now when we read biography of the mother, whose given name was Mira Alfasa, right from childhood, she was born, from early years, she had this inner knowledge that she is here for a different purpose on this earth. So as we continue her life journey in her early years itself, she has visions of many advanced yogis and, spiritually realized people. And there is one particular figure that she begins to call as Krishna. Now, she has no idea of who Krishna is, or she has not even read Bhagavad Gita at that time. She was given a copy of Bhagavad Gita, a very poor translation later on. But when she sees in 1914 Sri Aurobindo in Pondicherry, her husband at the time was French person who wanted to be, because Pondicherry was French colony, so he came there to be a part of the French government. When she meets him for the first time, she recognizes him as the Krishna of her visions.
Oh, okay. Oh.
So that's how the association begins. And Sri Aurobindo recognizes in him the embodiment of the divine Shakti. And they continue to stay in touch while she goes back to Japan in 1914 after the World War starts. But then after the First World War is over, 1920, she comes back to India, straight to Pondicherry, never to leave Pondicherry again.
Yeah.
So when somebody asked the mother later on about, could you give us some reminiscences about yourself? She said, it will be very brief. I came to India to be with Sri Aurobindo. I stayed back in India. I continue to be here even after Sri Aurobindo left his body in 1950 to do his work. For her, Sri Aurobindo was the divine incarnate, the Lord incarnate. For him, she was the Supreme Mother incarnate. So it is like the Shiva and Shakti, or however we want to call it, using any of the Indian terms.
Yeah,
So
Ardhanarishwar.
Yeah, the Lord and his Shakti coming together. And then, of course, when we go deeper into the literature of integral yoga and the supramental yoga that they together were doing, because there were many things that the two had to come together. The dual avatar had to happen for the kind of supramental yoga that they were aiming at. So that's a very long, deep.
Yeah, understood. No, you just explained it very properly, that what is the core of mother, what is the relevance of mother. So thanks a lot, ma'am, taking your time and answering my queries. Thanks a lot, ma'am.
Thank you for asking this beautiful question.
No, ma'am, because your insight and your knowledge was very deep. So that's why I felt that, okay, why can't I ask you? Because books are having, I can get the answer from that. That's not a other thing way. But you have been a live knowledge, you can say, of just a bank of knowledge. So just I felt that, okay, I can ask you. So thanks a lot, ma'am.
All knowledge is hers. She's right here on my desk. So
yes, correct. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pranjal, and thank you so much, ma'am. It was really a feast to our eyes as well as ears. So nicely you brought out the contribution of Sri Aurobindo in front of our eyes, and we really learned a lot. It was very interesting to know the most dangerous man. He turned into a man of love and love for his country and his countrymen. And he also brought out the unsung hero, Barendra Kumar Ghosh. Ma'am, we actually, as our Honorable Vice Chancellor rightly pointed out, we request you to visit our institute, CUTN, and please enlighten our students also through your knowledge and your wisdom. And I also request Department of History to explore the unsung heroes of Tamil Nadu and bring out such an exhibition or an album so that it will be documented as we celebrate the Azaadi Amrit Mahotsav. So congratulating the History Department as well as Madam for exploring his story, and really it was wonderful, ma'am. Thank you so much for your lovely presentation and very beautiful and very knowledgeful presentation in fact. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pranjal, and thank you, Dr. Sahu, for this wonderful event. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for your kind words and for giving us this opportunity to hold this event here and bring all these facts to the students and the participants. And I thank Dr. Beloo again for this virtual exhibition. And as you have been invited by a Vice Chancellor and Resha ma'am, I hope very soon you can come to the university and again bring some more insightful information about Sri Aurobindo and his participation and his contribution to the Indian movement. So I thank everyone for attending this event.
Thank you, Dr. Pranjal.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Krishnan, the Honorable Vice Chancellor ji, and Dr. Sulochana ji, the registrar, and Dr. Sneha, everyone who participated. And thank you for the kind invitation. Look forward to more of such opportunities. Thank you, Dr. Pranjal, and everyone in your department who worked on making this happen. So it was my pleasure, and I look forward to seeing what more we can do together.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.